I think the one thing that people need to realize is we didn't do this to prove anybody wrong. We really brought in all the stakeholders to try to look at this potential signal so that if there was a signal, we could actually respond accordingly. And if there was if questions still needed to be answered, that we could figure those out. So the takeaway was several. The first was we brought in some oncologists to help with paclitaxel in itself. And what we've found out from them is that there are many patients that get large doses of paclitaxel over a long period of time, a year or more, so that there's no signal in that population. So the population we're talking about has a very small amount of drug, even smaller, but bigger than the coronary. So we have to be in between those two that haven't shown any mortality. They've also recently found out that paclitaxel is safe in second and third trimester for pregnant women and doesn't seem to affect the fetus as well. So that was one thing. I think we learned a lot more about paclitaxel. We also then reviewed how people die with peripheral arterial disease. We know they have an increased mortality rate, but what's their current pattern? We know a lot of it's cardiovascular, we get that. But what else is already out there? So we reviewed that, and how did they die in bare metal stent and PTA trials? What percentages? So we could get a lane or leveling of the field so that we had a better viewpoint as we looked to these drug-coated trials. We then looked at, where are we at with the meta-analysis? What's the different type of statistics, things like that. And what we found is that certainly the meta-analysis is a pretty high level of scientific rigor, but it would be higher with patient-level data. There were some assumptions that were made in the current meta-analysis that seemed to be not consistent with what we heard at the VLF. One being that they added drug-eluting stents to their trial, which to a certain extent contaminates the trial when you're trying to compare two different technologies, drug-coated balloon versus drug-coated stents. Because drug-coated stents that were looked at in that trial did not have any excipient, have minimal contamination or distal embolization. And even though they have a high density on the struts, the amount of paclitaxel you get for a certain length of device is less than the lowest drug-coated balloon. So the dose relationship that was reported in meta-analysis does not seem to be holding up. We also, as we looked at the different levels of death that we were seeing, we didn't see any smoking gun. There wasn't like an excess of any one type of death. So that's usually what you see when you see a medication or anything that's causing more death. There's usually a cause behind it. What's the etiology? And at the VLF, none of the experts could come up with that. It seemed like a good analogy that was described was a swimming pool was elevated, but so was the diving area and the kiddie pool. So there wasn't any, certain smoking gun type of thing. As we went farther out and started to look at the data that's out there currently, we looked at first the meta-analysis that said what of the trial data that they used was appropriate, not appropriate, or was it all cool? And what we looked at, just one example, is the Thunder trial. There was a disproportionate lack of accounting for the patients that had been lost to follow-up, which could have affected the results significantly. We then looked at the current CEC adjudicated data from the different companies, and we realized that this is a post hoc analysis and all those kind of things, but there wasn't any signal other than the IMPACT randomized trial and the Zevra PTX trial. Again, we were able to get a little bit more depth of detail because we were looking in these trials in more detail, and what we looked at in the DES trial was that there was a planned crossover for patients in the first year if they had restenosis that they could get a drug-coated device. I was on that trial. That's why we didn't really call a lot of attention to the mortality from intention to treat, because we knew about 30% of those patients got drug-eluting stents. And when we looked at those and compared those populations, there was no difference in those two groups. And from the IMPACT standpoint, when we looked at the IMPACT trial, there didn't seem to be a dose relationship that you certainly would have expected to see that. And then the other trials just weren't having much of a signal at all. We then said, well, where do we go from here? We had a lawyer talk about, the risks that we're all at or not having at, how we could potentially change our informed consents if we feel the need for that. We looked at the future, which was the potential use of alignments if we can get the technology to do that, but that's years away. And then the VIVA group discussed the fact that we've gotten agreements from the different industry leaders to share their patient-level data And we're going to have a committee independent of VIVA that looks at this, independent statistician group that was picked in a blinded fashion, not based on price, based on expertise. And so that'll be down in the future.